Dana White has a penchant for criticizing his company's fights severely. There were quite a few UFC contests that he despised. There are sure to be some fights that are less memorable than others, given how many fights there have been in the 30 years UFC has been in business. But not every match can measure up to Robbie Lawler vs. Rory MacDonald II. However, some fights were just so bad that UFC promoter Dana White couldn't justify their conclusions. Whether it was the fighter's performance, judges' decisions, or just some strange circumstance that should never have happened to begin with. Do you want to know why Dana White hates these fights? Do you want to know what happened at these events? Then I'm sure you don't want to miss out. Make sure you watch this video to the end, where we will talk about some of Dana White's most hated fights. But before we proceed, kindly press the subscribe button to get more videos like this. 5 UFC main events that Dana White hated. Wow, 2 champions in one fight? What do you think happened? Why does Dana White hate the fight between these 2 champions? Before the middleweight title match between Israel Adesanya and Yoel Romero, the main event of UFC 248 on Saturday night was on track to win Event of the Year. Although rising sensation Adesanya retained his title with a unanimous decision, the fans' night was ruined by the boring fight between himself and Romero, which included extended periods of inactivity. And according to UFC President Dana White, Romero, a deranged and timeless wonder, was solely at fault. White blamed Romero's strange performance, saying that in hindsight, he wished they had simply waited for Paulo Costa to recover instead of giving Romero another shot at the title. White made this statement during the post-fight press conference. Romero stepped out into the middle of the cage to begin the fight, set up a high guard, and stayed still for 2 minutes as Adesanya hopped around looking for an opening. Instead of it being a slow start, it ended up being the theme of the fight as Adesanya gradually gained the upper hand while Romero mostly searched for opportunities to counter, which never materialized. Instead, he received a broken leg, a defeat to the middleweight champion by unanimous decision, and the wrath of his employer, Dana White. He emerged as soon as the bell rang and simply stood there with his palms raised. Nothing about it makes any sense, White remarked. I anticipated that he would emerge in a manic condition after such a performance. Is there a way back to the title? You're insane to even pose that question at this time, White said. He didn't look good tonight. He appeared awful. He essentially lost a chance tonight. Perhaps he will return in his subsequent battle and resemble Yoel Romero. But if he doesn't, I wouldn't anticipate his fighting for another 10 years in that condition.
Right from the bell, he came out and just stood there with his hands up. Makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. I thought he was going to come out like a madman.
Unsurprisingly, Romero left the UFC for Bellator MMA following this disappointing match. Undoubtedly, one of the most eagerly awaited UFC fights ever was the contest between Quinton Rampage Jackson and Rashad Evans at UFC 114. The rivalry between the 2 light heavyweights was filled with bitterness, and it appeared that this matchup might result in some explosions. The fight, which was won by Evans by majority decision, wasn't quite as exciting as fans could have wanted. But it wasn't the worst UFC main event of all time either. In essence, Evans saw that he had significant advantage over Jackson in the grappling department and took advantage of it to win, mainly avoiding the brawl that was anticipated. Dana White was fairly silent after the fight, perhaps as a result of the stardom of both men. That changed about a year later when rumors of a Rashad vs. Rampage rematch started to spread online. Unexpectedly, UFC supporters looked enthusiastic about the concept, evidently forgetting how uninteresting the first fight had gone. But Dana White had completely different plans. In response to a question from USA Today regarding the likelihood of a rematch, the UFC president quickly dismissed the notion. Talking is fantastic before the combat, but if you do all this talking and then get in there and don't fight, who wants to see that shit again, he said. He continued by calling the clash a fucking bore fest a second time. Over 1 million people watched UFC 114 on pay-per-view, which may have been the reason White chose to remain silent at the time, but it was obvious from his response that this was one UFC main event he detested. The 2012 fight between Gray Maynard and Clay Guida, which was the main event of the UFC's 4th show on FX, is widely regarded as one of the worst main events in the promotion's history. Basically, despite Maynard's best efforts to make the fight watchable, Guida seemed content to simply circle the boxing ring. almost avoiding any kind of touch with his opponent. Unsurprisingly, Dana White had a lot to say about the fight afterward. It was a performance that was completely out of character for the Carpenter. White began by saying that he would have bet anything that the bout would have been exciting before appearing to completely exonerate Maynard. He claimed that the bully attempted to coerce Guida into the type of battle that the audience desired, but the Carpenter flat out refused to participate. Interesting though, White didn't entirely reserve his contempt for Guida. White said that some moron put it in his head that running around in circles may win him the fight, and they were dead wrong.
Nobody can win or lose a fight when a guy is running around in circles. He was literally running. You know,
a jab that seemed to be directed at coach Greg Jackson, who had prepared Guida for the fight following a protracted training camp. This was not the first time Dana White had directed a jab at Jackson, but in the end, everyone, not just Dana White, despised this fight. It came as no surprise when he said he didn't want to return to Atlantic City in that manner. Few things in a UFC main event irritate Dana White more than a fighter who promises to beat up their opponent in the boxing ring but doesn't follow through on that promise. That's probably why the UFC president disapproved of the 2020 fight between Curtis Blaydes and Alexander Volkov, which was the main event of UFC Vegas 3. Before the fight, Blaydes had promised that fans wouldn't see a stand-up war between himself and Drago. Instead, he suggested he'd simply ragdoll the Russian fighter around the cage in a one-sided beating. Blaydes did win the fight in a pretty lopsided fashion, but it wasn't the beating he promised to deliver. Razor instead largely out-wrestled Volkov for a decision. And to make matters worse, he appeared to run out of steam late in the fight.
He talked a lot of shit coming in this week. I don't think you talked the shit that he talked this week and come in and perform like that, talking about ragdolling people and he's not getting paid and yada yada. He should be getting a title shot. And, you know, he gassed out at the end of the third round.
Although it wasn't the worst headline ever, Dana White was upset after it. When you talk like he talked and perform like he performed tonight, you look stupid, he continued, adding that Blaydes had the wrong mentality. It's unclear whether UFC President Dana White's anger at Blaydes was genuinely caused by Blaydes' performance in the Volkov fight or by remarks he made about poor fighters' pay. But it's obvious that White didn't like this main event. The middleweight title battle between Anderson Silva and Demian Maia at UFC 112 may be the biggest headline fight in UFC history to anger UFC President Dana White the most. At the time, Silva's relationship with the UFC was already fragile. White had frequently referred to the current UFC middleweight champion as the finest pound-for-pound fighter in the world. But his reputation as a walking highlight reel had taken a hit after unimpressive wins over Patrick Cote and Thales Leites. However, after defeating Leites, the Spider stunned Forrest Griffin in just one round with one of the most iconic UFC knockouts ever. The fact that he would do the same to Maia in the main event of the UFC's first event in Abu Dhabi appeared to set the tone. That wasn't the case, though, because in a very odd contest, Silva stood, danced, and did barely enough to defeat Maia by a boring decision. Unsurprisingly, White blew up after the performance. The UFC president not only declined to hand Silva his title belt after the fight, putting it in the hands of Silva's manager Ed Suarez, but he also launched into an enraged rant.
It's the first time that I've ever walked out on a main event and given the belt to the guy's manager and told him to put it on him.
White stated that the fight was embarrassing, and even threatened to strip Silva of his title and cut him from the UFC altogether if he produced a similar performance in his next fight. Days later, cooler heads prevailed, with Suarez stating that he and Silva had met with White to clear the air and that they'd apologized to the UFC's head honcho. Still, this remains the angriest we've ever seen White following a UFC main event. Wow, from this video, you can see that Dana White does not take shit. What do you think we missed? Kindly drop them in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.